my name is Heather, and I'm a neurofeedback therapist. I just graduated with my master's in counseling psychology, but I did my thesis work on the therapeutic induction of altered states using neurofeedback, and I'm going to share that with you today. So first thing to understand is exactly what is neurofeedback and how does it work. So it's a self-regulation skill. It teaches you how to develop your self-awareness and how to kind of, in many ways, it's like meditation with a mirror. So subtly, we can teach individuals the differences between subtle states, and by being able to differentiate those subtle states, that's very useful in a therapeutic context, because often clients come in and they're kind of just a jumble. They're kind of stuck between everything and they don't really know how to differentiate which way they're feeling. So the way that neurofeedback does that, you can kind of look at the brain like a choir with like 1,000 singers, 100 million billion singers. But there's different choirs in different areas of the brain. And so as a neurofeedback therapist, I focus on which choir is singing well and how. So in a choir, we have our pitch, we have our volume, we have our song, we have our harmony. As a neurofeedback therapist, kind of the association there is frequency, amplitude, task, and functioning. So I'm trying to teach a choir how to sing well. That's what a choir is focused on. This is what I would be focused on. So a well-functioning brain requires frequency, rhythm, and timing to work well together. So these are your singers. And in a choir, we have everything from our bass to our tenor to soprano to mezzo-soprano. But in brain waves, that's delta, theta, alpha, beta, and high beta. And so if you kind of break it up, alpha in the middle is kind of the meeting place between our inner and outer awareness. So more dreamy states and intuitive states have to do with theta and delta. More cognitive on-task states have to do with our beta range. But at the same time, these guys can kind of get out of whack. So as a neurofeedback therapist, I want to teach choir. I want to teach them how to be in harmony. As the current therapeutic modalities that we have, how well do they kind of work towards this end? So medication has its place, but it tends to leave some of the choir members sick and having side effects. And maybe they don't want to show up for choir practice, or they don't really want to sing with each other because they're feeling a little bit nauseous that day. Electroshock therapy exists, but that often makes some of the choir members forget how to sing at all, and they completely forget to come. Talk therapy is great. We love talk therapy. We want to engage the prefrontal cortex. But the problem is you have to know how to sing. We're here for choir practice. And if someone can't sing, if they don't know how to have that prosody and that interaction this way, they're not always able to engage in talk therapy. Psychedelic therapies, that's why we're here. This is what we love. This is an awesome tuning fork. We know it's a reset. It just brings harmony, and that's wonderful, but they're still illegal. And we're not in the place where that's access to the public. And as a therapist, I want something that I can be giving my clients. So what is it in between? And I'm kind of proposing that maybe neurofeedback is something that we could be using as a bridge in between. And what neurofeedback does is it puts microphones around the choir. So to teach a choir to sing, it makes a lot of sense. You want to record the choir and play back to them. Hey, guess how well you're singing? How's it going? And the way a neurofeedback therapist does that, I reward them when they're in tune. So the more in tune the choir becomes, the more rewards they get. As soon as they become out of tune, it doesn't work. So the feedback operates based on harmony. So the more harmonic, the more feedback you get. As an overview for brainwaves, I thought this would just be kind of interesting, that when we're in a balanced state, this is sort of what you see. Someone's calm, they're intuitive, they're going to be feeling present and focused. But you can see on either end of the spectrum what starts happening. And that's not the whole brain, these are these individual choirs. This can happen uniquely there. So some choirs do require more of one or less of the other, so there is a bit of finessing that happens. But let's look specifically at depression and anxiety. So depression is actually an unbalance of the tenors in the front of the brain. You get too low activation on the left-hand side and too high on the right. And this more in the midline, alpha frequencies. Anxiety, insomnia, and headache disorders are the sopranos. They're just screaming, ah! And that causes that tension feeling. And so under-arousal is usually associated with depression, and over and stable arousal is associated with anxiety. But I come from a trauma lab, And in the trauma lab, we mostly are looking at dissociative states or complex PTSD. And what's going on with trauma is actually the alpha frequencies, your tenors. If you're listening to a choir and the tenors aren't singing, it's flat. If a band gets together and they practice and they don't have the rhythm section, it's going to be hard for everyone else to know what they're supposed to be doing. So when we don't have alpha, we have a loss of timing. And in dissociation, when individuals or someone with trauma closes their eyes, their alpha frequency doesn't increase as it should, it actually decreases. So their sense of self isn't showing up. And this is actually disorganized arousal. And this is why medications don't work well with trauma, because their patterns are so all over the place, you can't just target it with a medication, and that's why they're so hard to treat. I really, really like George Northoff's work, so I don't know if anyone's familiar with him, but he kind of went a little further too, talking about the spatial temporal continuity in consciousness. And this kind of relates to phase, synchrony, and coherence in neurofeedback. So in neurofeedback, we not just work with arousal, but we also work with how well are those networks talking to each other? Are they hypocoherent? Are they hypocoherent? How fast is the information coming through? Synchrony is useful, but too much synchrony creates a seizure. But a certain amount of synchrony creates an optimal kind of connection. And I thought it was really interesting that he talked about, even though schizophrenia is not my area, that in schizophrenia what happens is you imagine that it's like a bead of necklace, like a necklace with a bunch of beads, but you remove the string. And so the temporal continuity disappears, and so all those beads are just kind of rolling around randomly, and so there's a lot of confusion going on in their mind. They have all the pieces, they have all the choirs, but they have no idea how to link themselves together. Whereas with depression, they're actually locked in this like backward kind of formation. So they're singing the same song over and over again, they're getting kind of frustrated at it, they don't know how to learn a new song, they can't move forward. So for me, my interest is in the default mode network, because that's kind of the hub of where we kind of see what's going on with trauma, especially in post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is the ego. We know a lot about this from all the current research with psilocybin and LSD. And so if your tenors are not showing up, or the rhythm section is not showing up, it's going to be really hard for you to create a narrative and to have this really coherent autobiographical memory. You're also going to have a hard time understanding others or thinking about the future. And most often, your sense of self is so disrupted, this is the dissociative state. So right now, 50% of individuals with trauma are untreated by current methodologies. This is why we're offering psychedelics. But 30% of those are actually dissociative. And so in dissociation, hallucinogens are not always a good idea because they're actually already in a highly entropic state. So we actually need to make them more rigid. We need to bring them in. But how do we do that? How do we kick the default up without actually kind of putting them into a psychotic state? And we know MDMA can do this, that is a useful tool. So my colleagues were looking at alpha oscillation neurofeedback, and so it was already mentioned, this alpha theta state. And alpha theta was kind of one of the first deep state meditations or neurofeedbacks that were being used. And at first they thought it was the amount of crossover that happened between the alpha and the theta that was kind of the therapeutic component. But it actually turns out that it's how well somebody was able to reduce their alpha frequency and how many times they did it that was important. So they started focusing on the 8 to 12 and they created this alpha de-synchronization. And this is directly the highlights from their research, showing a shift in amygdala complex connectivity, a reduction in fear, moving more towards prefrontal regulation. So that reduces your arousal and you have greater resting alpha synchrony. Great, the drummers are showing up to practice. But then the psychedelic research started coming out and we're like, oh hey, wait a second, this looks exactly the same as a trauma brain. And so I was using mostly the psilocybin protocol where we realized, but it's not just 8 to 12 that's going down, it's actually 1 to 20. And in LSD, it's actually 1 to 25. And so that's kind of where my thesis was born. Well, let's try this. What happens if we use neurofeedback to reduce 1 to 20 instead? So here's my lab. Set and setting was really important. So we tried to make a comfortable environment for individuals to come into. They sit down, they fill out their questionnaires, nice lighting. I would turn the bright lights off and they would just have the salt lamps while they were in training. I'm only presenting on 23 participants. I ran this study, I ran 3 studies, over 100 people, but this is the data that I have for today. We looked at their traits, we looked at their level of absorption, we gave them a pre and post kind of mood state, how are you feeling? I took a 3-minute baseline, 15-minute active condition, and then a 3-minute baseline after. And then I gave them the altered state scale, because that's kind of standard in psychedelic research, and we wanted to see how close we were getting to these states. And then I followed up about the next day asking, how have you felt since the intervention? Just an open-ended question in an email. So this is an example of someone actually experiencing the protocol. I did later use a full cap EEG, but for this one we used the 14 channel. So I analyzed the 14 channels and the single training electrode. For my feedback, I used fractals, because I kind of just love fractals in general, but I also find that fractals, you can't really hold on to a fractal. A fractal is constantly changing, right? And I'm trying to allow people to be in a bit of a flow state. And the way the feedback worked is the fractals are playing on the screen, and as long as you are reducing your 1 to 20, and we're training the default mode network, the screen is clear. The second you stop reducing the screen, there's like a white fog that starts coming in, and you can't see the pretty fractals anymore. Oh no. And so my own experience, and other people told me, that it's when you really allowed yourself to let go and kind of entered into this flow state, that's when you get the nice clean screen. If you start thinking or ruminating or anything, it kind of fogs up again. So this was kind of, the turquoise is our 1 to 20, and this is based off Struder's kind of research with psilocybin and MDMA. And I mean, it's not unlike the pattern. There's some similarity there. Definitely further research needs to go into this, but particularly with experiences of unity, bliss, insightfulness, disembodiment in particular, that's more stuff that's in my thesis, but we found some really interesting correlations there. Reductions in anxiety, and actually an increase in audiovisual synesthesia. So I'm just going to kind of focus on a little bit of the EEG findings. We broke the 15-minute intervention up into 5-minute, 5 3-minute epochs, so little time segments. And we noticed that near the end that there was this crossover in the frontal hemispheres. And often this crossover is associated with we're heightening on the left, lowering on the right. And when I talked about it earlier, that imbalance of the tenors, so possibly that's what's going on here. And also with the crossover, there could be an increase in synchronicity and coherence. This is just the single training electrode. And this was completely counterintuitive. This is not what we expected to find. We didn't expect 1 to 20 to be going up. So trying to understand that a little more, we broke it down into individual bandwidths. So we actually found that alpha increased in the back of the head, but alpha decreased everywhere else in the head. That increase in alpha is actually what we're trying to see. And as a neurofeedback therapist, it's actually really hard to increase alpha individuals. It's one of the more difficult things you can do. So that was kind of exciting. Saw a decrease in delta. Now, delta is associated with altered states, but in trauma, delta means that the brainstem's in charge. It means that the limbic and the prefrontal cortex are not online, and we don't want to see that. Delta shouldn't be popping up when you're awake, unless you're in some deep meditative trance. So a decrease in delta could be meaning that they're having a little more regulation. An increase in theta, however, is that more meditative, that more intuitive, that more trancey kind of state. Betas went down, so our sopranos, those two high guys, they showed that they reduced. And when we looked at the PALM scores, people said, yeah, I did feel more relaxed after the study. I felt a lot better. And then an increase in gamma. Now, gamma is kind of exciting because it has a lot to do with neuroplasticity and processing new circuits. Synchronization has been seen in meditation experts. It can be related to cortical restructuring and altered perception. And my neurofeedback teacher has told me that altered states, you actually see this enveloping of theta and alpha enveloped inside of gamma bursts. So further research needs to happen for sure to understand if that's what we see, but I do think that this is kind of inspiring so far. So then when I looked at the actual questionnaire data, I noticed that it kind of factored nicely into Fadiman's microdosing. So his findings with lessening in anxiety, ability to restructure problems, more creativity, more empathy, the subconscious being more accessible, feeling more motivation. And so here's some feedback from some participants to help you see how they overlap. Feeling a huge difference in myself. My senses were heightened. I felt calm and aware, like time was moving slowly. Memories and feelings were easier to access. I could think more clearly. This participant also reported feeling more calm and tranquil. I remember her, she was saying, I felt that my subconscious was coming up and I was processing all these things during the intervention. It was just this really strange feeling. And then afterwards she said she just such this immediate sense of relief from this processing that occurred. A couple more, again, just key points. Easier to focus, less distracted. I appreciated music more. I was more alive, sensitive, alert. My stress faded. This individual said they had this idea for an essay that they'd been struggling with, and they were able to write it really easily. Again, time, that loss of time, more in tune and aware with my surroundings, and bubbly. I definitely noticed personally, I did this quite a bit throughout my master's. I found it helped me get through my degree, and I felt motivated, I felt focused, I felt grounded. I really enjoyed the protocol. So moving forward, we want to integrate, right? As we start working with these individuals, the more integrative we can come with our treatments, the more options we can offer people as clinicians. But part of something that I did with my undergrad before I did my master's was I focused on mindfulness states. And we often see that individuals see this increase in mindfulness following psychedelic experiences. But understanding the neural correlates of that and what are like the kind of foundational shifts that someone experiences in mindfulness that are common to all the practices is really important. And Shinzen Young does a wonderful job of kind of highlighting this. So I've taken it from his book, but it also overlaps with my understanding. And it doesn't really matter which order you kind of put these in. Different traditions will argue that you need focus first or you need sensory clarity first, but it depends on the person and what works best for them. But we do want to be able to task switch mentally. We do want to be able to understand our emotional selves. And we do want to be able to develop a level of equanimity toward all of those experiences and thoughts. And then that cultivates a sense of compassion. And while I was doing my research, I came across Dr. Jeff Tarrant, who started the Neuro Meditation Institute, and he has mindfulness protocols for neurofeedback that validate each of these states. So you could come in and you could have a neurofeedback session. Hey, am I doing my meditation right? How is this working? And we could be watching your brainwaves and validating, yeah, that's that state. And so you have a couple sessions with that, and that validates you can go off and feel more confident in your practice. This is what I'm doing. And that would be a wonderful thing to be giving clients who are struggling with dysregulation. So overall, I kind of started looking at neurofeedback as physiotherapy for brain networks. I also like calling myself a brain DJ, you know, just like tweaking knobs and bubbling around. So I kind of think that there's this whole rainbow bridge of awareness in states that we can start to be comfortable with between psychedelics and between normal waking consciousness. And the more comfortable we are with the spectrum, the less of a kind of shock it is when we switch between, but also the more chance we have of kind of living in more of a flow state or more grounded, kind of open, mystical state. So I've kind of paired with the Neuro Meditation Institute and a company named Brain Avatar and Terra Incognita, and we've kind of been honing the neurofeedback protocols I've been working on to try to take them to the next level. I also think it'd be really cool to use neurofeedback as a preface for psychedelic therapy, so giving people these mindfulness skills. We've been pairing mindfulness already, but really validating if that's the way we should, like, for the individual, if that's feeling good or not. So then when they go into the psychedelic state, perhaps they're more likely to have a mystical experience that we know produces more outcomes. And then afterwards, could we record the shift in their brainwave and then be rewarding them for that shift? So as we start losing the afterglow, could I have had that, okay, here's the more regulated state. 2 weeks later, you're starting to lose it. Can I train you back? Is that possible? I don't know. I've also noticed that individuals who are microdosing of their own free will potentially train a little bit faster with neurofeedback. So what could be happening is that maybe it's like getting a massage before you go see the physiotherapist. A microdose of a substance kind of softens the networks, and then that allows there to be more flexibility to train the networks. So this is the Brain Avatar activity. And what's really cool with Brain Avatar, because it's a full 1020 cap EEG, you can actually train specific areas of the brain. So if I want to be working specifically with the default mode network, I can see, which areas are going down, how is it going down? And then we've added some midline structures to my protocol, and we're finding that that induces more of a psychedelic state. But for, say, MDMA, you can train the right insula and the anterior cingulate cortex and help someone experience a more of a loving kindness state. So I just think these are all areas that are worth considering and experimenting with a little bit further. So thank you for listening.